in fact, Europeans think it's very strange when the American president, no matter who he is, says, "God bless America," because it just seems totally at odds with kind of the officially secular European opinion of the nation state. But in America, even though the government is technically secular in the sense that it doesn't endorse a particular religion, there is a very strong undercurrent of religious identity, of religious sentiment in the country. And even though religious practice has declined really precipitously in the last generation or two, I don't think that kind of association is going away anytime soon.
Okay.
And so I think it's good that now people have different opinions about these things like almost anything else, but we do have 2 days in the year when a civil commemoration is brought into the liturgy in this country. One is Thanksgiving.
Really? Okay.
And the other is, of course, July the 4th, tomorrow.
Right.
There's a special collection of mass texts and readings for both days. And really, it's a way of kind of baptizing this civil observance. And it's, rather than keep these things at an arm length from the liturgy or from the official prayer of the church, it's a way of bringing them in to a certain extent. And of course, it's good to pray for one's country. It's good to pray for blessings upon one's country, no matter what country that is.
Yeah, and there's no conflict there at all.
And the sanctification of one's nation. Nothing in the prayers of the Mass for Independence Day has to do with endorsing a particular political program.
Yeah.
Nor does it really even kind of endorse the Constitution, which would not be a terrible thing to do, obviously, because it is the foundational document of identity of our country. But it's a series of prayers asking God's blessings upon our nation, and also asking that we rise, that we who are making those prayers and making them our own and participating in them, that we rise to the occasion that our citizenship in this country presents to us. That we be catalysts and missionaries, really, for the evangelization of our country.
Okay, that's actually encouraging to me to know that there are mass texts that do address our native country and July 4th, Independence Day. So that's actually really good. I know there's a lot more than just July 4th happening in the month of July. Last month was dedicated to the Sacred Heart.
Correct.
Is there a monthly dedication for every month?
There is. There's nothing set in stone, and it's not an article of faith, but by tradition, just human tradition over the centuries, different associations with different devotions have been attached to the 12 months of the year, usually rooted in some feast day of that particular month. And the month of July has, for many centuries, been associated with the precious blood of Christ. And in relatively recent times, there was actually a feast day of the precious blood that was always the first Sunday of July. And it was only on the books for about 100 years. And then when the calendar was reorganized and slimmed down a little bit in the 1960s, late 60s, that feast day, like a lot of other relatively modern feast days, was set aside to make room for other saints in the calendar. The ancient feast days were all retained, but this only had a tradition of about, I think, exactly 120 years.
That's not that long.
Which, in the view of the church, is a blink of an eye.
Right.
But there is a votive mass of the precious blood that could be celebrated at any time.
Oh, that's a great votive mass. What does votive mean?
Well, the votive masses are a collection of mass texts that are associated with certain mysteries of the faith. And they're found in the back of the Roman Missal. There's votive masses of the Blessed Virgin Mary, of the Sacred Heart, of the precious blood, of St. Joseph, of the guardian angels, and of all the angels. And so there's several different mass texts that can be celebrated according to the preference of the parish or of the celebrating priest on days, especially in ordinary time, which we find ourselves now, days which don't have an obligatory memorial or feast day.
Okay.
And it's a way of bringing a kind of variety into the liturgical cycle, and also of highlighting certain devotions which are very much alive still in the church today.
Okay. Now, when the mass texts change, that's not like the Eucharistic prayer, right? It's
just the what are called the propers, the parts of the mass that change from mass to mass. So the opening prayer, the collect, the prayer over the gifts, the offertory prayer, the various antiphons, and then, of course, the concluding prayer at the end of Mass, and maybe the preface before the
Okay.
Eucharistic prayer.
So there's
and there could be
certain parts,
be readings from which one could choose, or you could use the daily readings. So there are a lot of different ways of celebrating those specific devotions, but the principal texts are the three main prayers of the Mass: the collect, and then the offertory, and then the concluding prayer.
Gotcha. Okay, so precious blood. This would be actually a great month to use that votive mass.
Sure.
Okay,
Sure.
excellent. Can it be used on a Sunday, or is that considered
No.
obligatory?
No, because every Sunday's a small Easter, and nothing ever. Very rarely does a feast day oust Sundays in ordinary time. We would have it, for example, if a major solemnity occurred on a Sunday during ordinary time, it usually bumps the Sunday.
What would Assumption count for that?
Yes, it would.
Okay, so the
if
solemnity of Assumption.
If the Assumption, August 15th, were on a Sunday, one would celebrate the Assumption rather than the 20-some-odd week in ordinary time.
So you can use the votive mass on not a Sunday because the
That's
Sunday
correct.
always trumps it.
That's correct.
Gotcha.
And one could also not use it on for example, today, the Feast of St. Thomas, because it's a liturgical feast day, the second rank in liturgical celebrations, because Thomas obviously was an apostle.
I love that guy. Yeah.
Yes.
St.
Well,
Thomas.
it's fascinating. And I think, the reading from John today, John chapter 20, is the third instance in which we have the Thomas apostle quoted in the Gospel of John. He's not quoted in the other three Gospels. Only John quotes him. And, of course, this final encounter, which is in the Gospel today, is of the risen Lord appearing to the 12, and Thomas is there. He was absent on Easter Sunday. He was the last apostle to come out of hiding. And when the other apostles told him about the Lord being raised, he was skeptical, and he doubted, and that's why we call him Doubting Thomas. And the Lord appeared again, Divine Mercy Sunday, we call it today, and said, Thomas had said, unless I see, his wounds and the wounds of the nails and the spear in his side, I won't believe.
He's a little stubborn.
And a little bit stubborn, but also doubtful, and kind of taking refuge in his doubt. Maybe he was a little bit safer than admit that he was wrong.
Yeah.
About his lack of faith and his fleeing the Lord. But again, he makes an immediate declaration of the Lord's divinity, my Lord and my God, when he sees him. And Pope Benedict XVI, in a discourse some years ago, I think it was on a Wednesday audience, said that this encounter with Thomas shows us that Jesus can now be recognized by his wounds rather than by his face.
Right.
And when you think about it, the Lord's risen body was not healed of his wounds. Now, and we suspect, we can't say for sure, but we suspect that our risen bodies will be, if they're glorified, will be healed of any kind of affliction that marred the body during our life. But Jesus' body was not restored. And I think that raises a really interesting question. Why not? Why were not the wounds healed? No, they were not bloody wounds. At least we can presume they weren't. Maybe they were. But why were they not healed? Well, it's precisely because of the wounds that Jesus was incarnate, that Son of God became incarnate precisely to receive those wounds upon the cross. And because the wounds are the reason for his incarnation, it's fitting that they not be healed.
The glorified bodies will be what they need to be.
Well, there are a number of different ways of thinking about it. The ultimate answer is we're really not sure what the glorified body is like. We get some hints from the Lord's own glorified body, detail about the theological consensus of what that will mean. But, we can't know for sure until it happens, so be good.
I always thought it was odd the way that Thomas phrased it. Unless I put my hand into his side. You don't normally do that with people. Like, oh, I see you have a gaping wound there. Let me stick my hand inside it.
No, I think that was a way of his saying, I don't believe you.
Well, but also, that's the kind of symbolic of how we are in the body of Christ. Like, the church is the body of Christ. We are brought into that. We actually enter into it. And so Jesus' body, literally, through the wounds, like the wounds are the portal into the body, and it surrounds us and consumes us.
Well, St. Teresa of Avila would imagine herself crawling into the wound in the side of Christ and resting in his heart.
I mean, it sounds a little morbid, but it really is. It's,
Well,
it's like a hug.
An interesting connection between the devotion of this month of the precious blood and this gospel scene in John chapter 20 is what happens in the Passion account in St. Matthew when the crowd is calling for Barabbas to be freed and Jesus to be crucified. And what do the crowd say to punch